Hi, I'm Judith Carlisle. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me right now?
We can hear you.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
And I'm moderating today's panel. It's called Illuminating the Diversity and the Role of Yoga in Modern Society. And we're going to explore the power and the place of yoga relative to social change. And I'm going to start the panel with just a brief introduction to our panelists. And they are all together, Marsha Banks-Harold, Mayuri Bhandari, Shyam Ranganathan, and also Acharya Shunya. And Mayuri Bhandari makes use of her Jain background and training in her work as a dancer and a performer and a poet. And she's an asana-based movement coach, and she infuses her work with her passion for veganism, women's empowerment, and also studies of Brown experience and history. Her work includes engagement with multiple communities through dance. She's part of the Prison Yoga Plus Meditation. She's founded Moksha, Liberation Through Movement. She teaches dance therapy to disabled children in small town schools in India, and she's a graduate of the LMU Yoga Studies Master of Arts program. Marsha Banks is here with us this morning from Alexandria, Virginia, where she works as an engineer. And she's also the owner of the PIES, which stands for Physical, Intellectual, Emotional, and Spiritual Yoga Studios. And there she applies her training as a yoga therapist and a teacher. She created the My Body Don't Bend That Way series of yoga classes designed to create a more inclusive and accessible yoga experience to clients. And it emphasizes a supportive, inclusive, and diverse experience. Acharya Shunya is a traditional scholar and a classically trained master of Advaita Yoga and Ayurveda. She's the first female head of her 2,000-year-old Vedic spiritual lineage from northern India. She's the founder and president of the Awakened Self Foundation, which is located in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's the author of the best-selling book called Ayurveda Lifestyle Wisdom. And she also has a book that's just about to come out called The Sovereign Self, Claim Your Inner Joy and Freedom with the Empowering Wisdom of the Vedas, Upanishads, and Bhagavad Gita. And last but not least, Shyam Ranganathan is a researcher and author, translator, and scholar, as well as a philosophy professor. He comes to us from York University in Canada, where he's in the Department of Philosophy and also associated with the York Center for Asian Research. His work ranges across philosophical traditions as he investigates the moral and political philosophies, philosophy of thought and language, philosophy of language, the study of East Asian and South Asian philosophy, as well as the impact of widespread assumptions that underpin the so-called Western tradition. And you'll recognize him as our keynote speaker. So I want to thank each of you for being here today. And I want to start the panel today with some questions directed to all of the panelists. And the first one, I'd just like to find out from each of you, what was the inspiration for the work that you're doing currently? And I'd like to ask Mayuri to start us off.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I think it's just been a mix of a lot of things, not only what I've experienced growing up and kind of my fusion of backgrounds and me as an artist, but also what I witness around going on around me, whether that's within the yoga culture or outside of even yoga. And it just inspires me as an artist through acting, dance, movement, and poetry. So whenever I witness something that comes, from my culture, even issues with appropriation or just questioning and critiquing what's going on, reflecting what's going on in our society or the systems that we have. That's what inspires me to create the art, I guess.
That's very inspiring to me too. I think a lot of that can be applicable for many of us. Dr. Ranganathan, would you like to tell us what inspires you personally to undertake the work that you do?
Well, yeah, that's actually a really difficult question to answer. I thought, when you asked that question, the first thing I thought, well, I never actually enjoyed being told what to do from the time I was a little kid. And so yoga is actually just the natural outcome of just wanting to be in charge of your own life. I think as I grew up, I know a lot of people reconcile these tensions in different ways, but I felt as though I was always, there were competing expectations from, say, family and the outside world, and I failed everybody's expectations. And one of the criteria of expectations that you just had to kind of toe the line, and I found it impossible to do so. I suppose being a kid born in Toronto that was brown. So, you know, there were ways in which I didn't fit into the wider Canadian society I was born into, and there's ways that I just didn't fit into my family for those very same reasons. And then then I went on to philosophy, and I love philosophy because you didn't have to agree with anybody to get along with people. I was like, this is great. These are my people. And then yoga started presenting itself to me as the philosophical solution to like just a wide range of technical problems. But then it just started impressing upon me this, we live under these false set of expectations that life will be good if we just kind of follow some story about the way we're supposed to live, instead of each one of us taking charge of that. So it kind of ramped up as I grew older, I suppose.
Okay. And then next, Marsha.
Yes, so my personal story basically is in line with not really fitting into any particular culture, any particular way of thinking. I'm an electrical engineer, and I found that because I was good at math and science in early elementary school, in high school, there were several instances in when my teacher said, hey, this is not for you. Study English, don't study engineering. And of course, just being the person that I am, I persevered through that. And then when I went to college, I experienced very similar situations where professors were discouraging me from being a woman engineer, being a Black woman engineer. And then working in my profession, very similar occurrences that continue to occur as I approach glass ceilings, as I interact with my colleagues who do not value who I am, the intelligence that I bring to the table. And so really my personal work came out of being extremely uncertain of who I was in this world, where I climbed the corporate ladder quickly. I made really good grades. I got accepted into the best colleges. However, when I entered those places that I thought would be safe, they turned out not to be safe. And the other reason that I am committed to the people that I serve is because I became the legal guardian to 2 children who had special needs. And this world, unfortunately, did not uplift them. It was quite a struggle to be able to get them the help that they needed. And I also have 2 gifted biological children. So the work that I do really surrounds the personal experiences that I've had as a Black woman, as a Black mother, and as an engineer.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to also ask Shunya if you could let us know. How does yoga provide, what is the inspiration for the work that you do currently? Shunya?
So, namaste everyone on the panel. Hello, Judith, nice to see you. 53 springs ago, karma decided I would be born in an illustrious family. I didn't know it's illustrious, it was just my family in Ayodhya, Uttar Pradesh, India. And my grandfather, great-grandfather, and teachers before them have been teaching in an uninterrupted fashion, Advaita Vedanta or non-dual teachings from the Upanishads, specifically the teachings of Shankara. And we are a Rigvedic family. And I came in the 1960s, and India's pretty patriarchal still in pockets, but because of the non-dual living of that reality, we were a pretty progressive family. And amongst a dozen or so choices that my guru, my grandfather had, who was a well-known figure in Ayodhya, he chose me. And I went through a fire ceremony at 9 And I thought that was a fun thing to do, just get dressed up and walk around the fire. I'm still living to this day the consequences of walking that fire, because that fire was lit inside me. And that the circular motion I went through with my teacher, following him, I came back with so many gems. Now, there's a lot of guru bashing going on. There is a lot of confusions around the source texts, like either we make them holy or we want to throw them out. And I'm the middle of the path teacher who is eloquently able to be an ambassador of the Shastra, because it is said, Shastra Trayate iti Shastram. When we understand the Shastra, we find a whole universal invitation there. They first command us, then they enlighten us, and ultimately they protect us. And hello, everyone. I had a perfect life in terms of the opportunities, but then I faced deaths in the family, broken relationships, difficulties in my 20s and 30s. So I've come back at all of this knowledge. It became a boat to take me ashore. And I realized that these teachings that were given to me by my grandfather in such kindliness were really helping me. So I apply them in my modern life, modern relationships, myself as a leader of Ayurveda, Yoga, Vedanta in the modern world. And they don't fail me. And I don't have stories of being abused or misused by a cult or a guru. And one of the reasons is that the Vedas or the Upanishads and the yogic tradition lay out very precise guidelines of who is a teacher and who is not. And when we come from that kind of engagement, we have much better experiences personally and for each other. So I think I'm an ambassador of all this knowledge, and my life, despite the deaths I had to face, the losses of relationships, I feel sovereign. And that's why I ended up writing The Sovereign Self, which is all about not power over another or having your life's ducks line up a certain way, but to feel sovereign within, as Lord Krishna has said in the Bhagavad Gita, that Dukheshu anudvigna manaha, Sukheshu vigata sprihaha, Vitiraga bhaya krodaha, Sitabdhira muniruchate. Who is sovereign? The one who doesn't collapse when life is not working out, one who doesn't get greedy and arrogant when life is working out, who can stay away from the whirlpools of attachment, sorrow, and anger. And they are anchored in their inner yogi. And that's the whole theme of my book, my life, and my teachings. Thank you.
Is there a commonality here in that each one of you has spoken about a space that you found to either explore, come to know yourself better, or to just exist as yourself, and that inspiration has led you here to this very panel right now this morning, right? But it also, I think, to me, some of you addressed this idea of otherness, while others expressed a coming into a comfort with yourself. And that makes me think of the relationship of yoga and colonialism and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so I'd like to direct our attention to how these people, BIPOC yogis, have been placed in precarious positions of ambassadorship, educators, and therapists, frequently helping others address white shame, guilt, fragility, etc., while they continue to personally experience the systemic oppression. How do you, each of you, I'd like to address again, all four of you, how do each of you address these issues? And how do you think allies might authentically support BIPOC as in day-to-day life without simply resorting to performative gestures? And I'm going to start with Shyam for this answer.
Oh, okay, thanks. So I think, well, with respect to the question of allies, I think one thing that's important is to recognize what BIPOC folks have to contribute when they have something to contribute, right? So those of us who are serious about this have something to share, but not by virtue of being BIPOC, because we have something to share. But being BIPOC means that we're not treated as people who have something to share, right? And something to teach. So I think taking us seriously as teachers, or at least contributors to the conversation, right, would be remarkable. That involves getting over a lot of fragile egos where, you know, people got to positions of influence and power even though they had nothing to share. I think that's the problem, because if they start to recognize that we as individuals have something to share, they have to recognize that they don't. That's not to say everybody who's, you know, I'm not saying everybody who isn't, you know, who isn't BIPOC doesn't have something to share, but a lot of times because of privilege, right, people get to these positions because of the system, not because of them. And so it seems to me that that's the major, you know, we don't need to be pitied. You should learn from it. We have something to teach, right? That seems to me what's missing from the discourse. So it would be cool if allies recognize that.
You brought up in your keynote this concept of the white credibility, right?
Yeah.
And I can see that would relate to this recognition that others don't default to this position of authority, and by measure simply by being women or being BIPOC, and that this can give us some insight into how to address that particular problem immediately, right? So Mayuri, would you like to also address this for us?
Yeah, can you please repeat the question just one more time? I want to make sure I address it appropriately.
Well, so it has to do with the ideas of non-BIPOC people acting as allies and how they can best effectively take on that role in day-to-day life without merely resorting to performative gesture, being authentic in that role as an ally.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's very interesting because I feel like it's such a, this question can go so broad, and it can really, I mean, it's a huge thing. And this is of course coming from my perspective, but I think that sometimes there's a certain level of respect, humility, and accountability. And I think that that is what I feel is lacking most of the time. Most people that approach yoga have well intentions, you know, they have good intentions, or they experience something great and want to share that with others. But because of these certification yoga studio setups in the Western yoga culture space, I feel that, you know, this connection to, we can't separate yoga from India. We can't separate yoga from certain aspects of culture and traditions. Yes, it can be put in different parts of Indian religions, or it can be separated to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, there is a connection and there's an understanding of the roots, of the heritage, of the history of even how yoga came about and what it's become in consumerist capitalist culture. I mean, the fact that sometimes I think I speak for myself, but I know a lot of women who can resonate. A lot of Indian people feel very uncomfortable. You won't see a lot of Indian people in the yoga space. You won't see a lot of Indian people in the yoga studios, in certifications, in places, because it does feel like something's being taken out, stripped of its meaning, plastered in pop culture, resold, capitalized, commercialized, exotified, and commodified. And so having that narration come back is very interesting. And I think that there are a lot of people who are speaking, you know, whether it's wonderful people have written like Shrina Gandhi, Reena Deshpande, you know, different women, ABCD Yogi. There are different Indian women of color who have written different articles. And I think one of the things that Shrina Gandhi mentions is that it's not so much saying that, okay, look, there's so many white people doing this and, you know, where's the representation? It's more like, how can we invite this dialogue in spaces like certifications, studios, you know, yoga conferences in the Western space, yoga culture, where sometimes I find that yoga is, the yoga culture is enhancing the ego rather than working on the ego. It's almost becoming the antithesis. So can we have this space where people are able to speak, and that we understand as teachers going in that it's not just going to be what we're learning in the certification or what we've been being told by Yoga Alliance. We have to go much deeper than just the physical sense of asana or what the training or the studio's gearing towards their teacher training and who they want to build in their space, are we not only opening these dialogues, but having these conversations on cultural appropriation, or how we are, how we are having these conversations, and what it means to go deeper within, and how it's reflecting in society. Because honestly, it doesn't surprise me that it almost feels a little bit dangerous that, there's been talk of QAnon, there's so much rise in the for that. And I feel like that doesn't surprise me, because we need to have not only these conversations, but open up these spaces to be willing to make these changes, and not say, how can we bring just more people of color in this space, but more so, how can we have places where we're actually taking, like you said, beyond performing it, actually saying that we're gonna educate ourselves more, and we're gonna have these dialogues, and we're actually gonna take these voices into consideration. So this is a very long-winded way of saying and getting to a lot of things, but I think that addresses what I was talking about.
Thank you. Thank you. Marsha, I'm going to slightly change the question to you, because you do have an explicit expressed interest in making yoga accessible. And so for those yoga is traditionally non-accessible, how can people who fall under that umbrella of able-bodied, people who are more comfortable in yoga studios, and maybe you want to define that a bit, how can all of us or those people act as allies to people who have been excluded because yoga has not been accessible to them?
Well, thank you for that question. Definitely, this is a great opportunity for all beings to come together. It really is about inclusivity. It's about welcoming people and accepting people as they are when they walk through the door. I know my experiences when I've walked into yoga studios have been, what are you here for? Can you do these poses? Are you, and even in my own space, I own 2 yoga studios, but people walk into the spaces and they question, are you really the owner? Are you certified? Do you know yoga? And so this is a time for us really to practice what the sutras teach us anyway, really accepting people for who they are and where they are in their lives. And that really starts with the first interaction, greeting people, accepting them as they are, not expecting people to dress a certain way or to come from a particular social economic status in order to be even permitted into these spaces. So I think this is an opportunity just to talk with people, to honor who they are, not to expect them to be who you would like them to be, and more importantly, not to be intimidated or threatened by people because they're different than you. We are all human. And I think that's really the factor. You know, the sutras and the Bhagavad Gita teach us this very clearly. Show up, work together as a community, accept yourself and accept others. So I think that really is at the seat of where we have an opportunity to just be inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that, this idea of each of us being our best, turning to the teachings that we all share in common as part of a yoga community. Shunya, could you address maybe on a more personal, person-to-person level, how we might all be allies to one another as we work to create a just world? Shunya?
She may have dropped off. Maybe
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, now, yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what happened, but I'm here.
Hi.
And I was listening very deeply, and beautiful teachings, and Dr. Shyam, beautiful keynote. And it brought a lot to my mind. So when I came into this country more than 2 decades ago, I didn't know any of these issues because I lived amongst people who looked like me. But once I came here, it took me a while, but I realized that there are these subtle, not vocalized, because I live in California, divides. And one of the decisions I took, because I believe in inner sovereignty, was that I decided to be and dress and represent my culture. And I have mostly students who are not Indians. And I have always told them to be themselves. So in my, for example, the kind of culture I create is celebration of yourself, not my Indianness. Whereas then when I pick up a text and I have to then go into the genealogy of that text, and then yes, we go into the geography and the culture and the era of India. And as Mayuri said, you can't just separate it and estrange it, and then it would be this strange, weird thing that's popping around and gives people as Shyam had said, they start saying, well, it's just an opinion. And then what that does is it works against humanity, because here is this great yogic teaching. These are tools for sovereignty, for power, for gracious dharmic life. And we kind of start reinventing them. But what each one of us can do, if we represent the indigenous, the Asian, the Latin, the less represented, the Black, these communities, and even mixed gender communities, then we want to bring pride and beauty and ownership into it. That's one way I work with it. And I've taught at yoga festivals where I'm wearing a sari and everybody else is wearing a tank top, and that's okay, because I let them be themselves and I want to be myself, and it's been beautiful. So that's one thing. Another thing I feel is that when I look at our scriptures, I see, like in the Mahabharata, we see that there is more than one Gita that is taught between Krishna and Arjuna. There is actually a Gita called Vyada Gita, which is taught by a butcher. A butcher teaches the lessons of karma yoga and jnana yoga to an arrogant yogi Brahmin. So we've seen what did Professor Shyam say? Um, yeah, it's like a privilege. So we've seen privilege in India itself, between varnas, between castes. And what did our leaders do? What did the rishis do? What did Vyasa do when he created Mahabharata? He need not have inserted the Vyada Gita spoken by a butcher. Actually, that arrogant Brahmin who thought he knew everything got a lesson or two from a homemaker, a simple homemaker who knew no Sanskrit, but she was devoted in karma yoga towards her elders in the family, and from a butcher who did his duty with karma yoga. So we have that. Then in Srimad Bhagavatam, which is another text, Judith, we have a prostitute, a woman who sells her body called Pingala, who becomes self-realized. And then she teaches through the Srimad Bhagavatam, and till today she's teaching all of us. So when we go back to the ancient yogic texts, so the next point I'm trying to say is more awareness that there is a impetus towards unity in diversity, towards inclusiveness, towards not becoming stereotyped into, because I'm white, I have this privilege, or because because I'm Brahmin, I have this privilege, or then or because I'm brown, I have this privilege. And do we know what we are talking about? Have we gone through the due education? Do we know whatever that scope of education is set out for our country, culture, era? People like me, we have to go through 14 years of education. Fine. Have we done that? What have we done? What have we accomplished? Are we ready to be representatives? But merely color or caste in India, or institution that you belong to, and as we see even in modern science, if your paper was published in a elite journal, then you've made it. And these are all like symptoms of a very estranged society. I don't think I can only blame the white for it. I think we are looking towards the labels that justify knowledge versus letting our heart and our truth speak for ourselves. So in summary, I am a representative of my people, my culture, while embracing others with an open heart, because that is what Advaita is about. but I never let go of my roots. I remember early on, a branding PR person came up to me and said, they were a student, and said that, Shunya, you would have a lot bigger following if you stop wearing the clothes you wear. And I didn't do that. I am who I am. And that's how I move forward. And I try to teach yoga. Thank you.
Thank you, Shunya. I'd like to move the panel to another place where I want to address each of you specifically for perhaps a longer period of time, but maybe about 5 minutes each. And, you know, Mayuri, I'd like to start with you and give you this question. You're a person who has been raised in two different cultures, in the West and also in India. And you are raised as a Jain. And I wanted to know what some of your views are on what we might all call yoga culture right now at this period of time, as it exists in the West. And if you could just lead us into some of that.
Okay. Yeah, I was born and raised here my whole life, but I've been to India so much. All my family lives back there, and I've done a lot of work there as well. So there's just this beautiful mesh that I have. And also sometimes I feel like this sense of responsibility in a weird way, just to speak sometimes. But yeah, I don't know if you're looking also from a Jain perspective for this or not.
Sure.
But I think that being raised in Jainism, with those of you who may not be familiar, it's very similar to Buddhism. It's about 1% of the population, very focused on ahimsa in thought, speech, and action. And I think that, you know, what I find is that with nonviolence, and there's just so much yoga that is present within certain Jain practices, I definitely think that influenced me growing up. But what I noticed was it was just so much work within, not necessarily on the outside, so much responsibility, accountability within before going anywhere else. And yoga culture is very interesting to me. I think I've addressed a few things in the earlier question, but like I was saying, I was alluding to the fact that I do feel like the yoga culture, like I said, is almost the antithesis. It's ego enhancing, I feel, more so than working on the ego. It is definitely more asana based, which is fine, but I feel like there does need to be this further lead into the deeper aspects of it, because people talk about yoga being a safe space, people talking about peace and love and unity, but I'm not seeing that same culture being represented off the mat. So when we're talking about studio spaces, we're talking about, you know, certifications and retreat locations and yoga celebrities and yoga conferences. It's like, if we're really talking about working on the self, the language that's used, sometimes flowery language, or however people want to call a vinyasa class, can be basically a term for whatever class it wants to be. There's no yoga police per se, not that there needs to be, but again, this certain sense of like, anybody can just buy their way to titles or certifications, like the more money you have, you know, whereas where are these ideals being represented for people of color in lower income communities? Why are classes the amount that they are? Why is there yoga attire that doesn't even exist for a real yogi? Even the term yogi is very controversial for me, because I think of a yogi as a person in India who's renounced their life. This is not a part-time job or their choice on the side. This is their way of life, to renounce and to really work on the self. And yoga ashrams were that way. And yoga wasn't necessarily something that everybody did, but yoga was something that had a lot of colonialist influence. People weren't allowed to do it, you know, and only when it became accepted in Western culture, because it had to be proven as scientific or something appropriate in the Western space that was legitimate, you know, then it's accepted in the Western culture. And when it's stripped of any Sanskrit or anything exotic or anything crazy, then it's something that it's accepted because there's actual benefits to it. But let's just cherry pick and take the parts that work, that sell for the package, but not the rest. And so there's a lot of questions that come up from that, because it's not so much to be about who's just teaching it, because 99% of my experience is going to be a class, is going to be that teacher. And I don't mind who that is, but do you really know what you're talking about? And I think Marsha, Dr. Marsha was alluding to this as well, is what are we really speaking about? And so when I speak of the studios and these certifications, where's the responsibility? If you're going to be a yoga studio, a yoga ashram, you're going to teach your style, whatever that means, how are you reflecting in society? Because karma yoga is not just yoga. We've got karma yoga, we've got jnana yoga, we've got bhakti yoga. There's so many types of yoga, and so if we're talking about karma yoga, working with the community, then if there's Black Lives Matter going on right now, if there's issues going on right now, indigenous rights, that we need to know about the land we're on. We need to know our history. We need to know. And so where's all of that, rather than just this peaceful false sense of safe space that's like creating this false sense of, how do I want to call it, superiority almost, and ignorance, to just be like, okay, I'm just going to take care of like my physical self and just kind of like wash out anything going on the outside, rather than just saying, okay, this is the asanas are a first step. Asana is actually the third limb, if we're going to go by 8 limbs. We're talking about yamas and niyamas, ethics and morals. Where is that in the conversation? We're just talking about beautifying our butt as a positive way of like, that's a positive side effect, I like to call it. It's not, the main goal. The main goal is really working on the self, and that's uncomfortable. That's not pretty and flowery and this space that's like making you feel great. It's actually a lot of work, and it's a lot of questioning everything that we know on the outside. Mainly it's questioning our own minds. But if the language in yoga studios is going to enhance our ego and make us think we can do no wrong and everything we think we do is right, well, then that's why we have major QAnon supporters. Or it doesn't surprise me. It's like with BLM or all of these things, like people are like, oh, America's actually racist, or there's a lot of issues. It's like, that stuff was there. It just wasn't out on the surface. Mm-hmm. And so these uncomfortabilities, these microaggressions, everything we want to talk about, it's really there. It's just a matter of, are we ready to step on uncomfortability, take this off the mat, so to speak, and really apply it with what's going on? Are we doing our part as a yoga community, rather than just making money and becoming celebrities, because that's just the thing that it needs to be? And are we really applying this? And that's where my questions arise. That's where this dialogue needs to be, because it's not so much about just India or just we need Indian teachers in this space. That's not what I'm talking about. It's about, again, accountability, respect, and humility. I said that at the start. I can keep going, but I think that I feel very lucky that I was raised with both, and I have the connection that I do have. But a lot of the times I didn't speak because of that, because I'm not one to like immediately go out and say something, because I observed a lot. But at a certain point, you're just like, how much am I going to experience this within before actually speaking out? Because I also give people benefit of the doubt, and I understand it's a case-by-case basis, but there is an overall culture and a movement. And I think that it's, like I said, it's the antithesis. So I feel, to what yoga is about, to what union with self, yoking of the self is about, if we're going to go into detail. And I can go into minor details as well, but there's a lot of critique, a lot of questioning, and a lot of, like I said, like, we need to really understand who we're learning from, what we're doing for ourselves, how much deeper do we need to go, and not just be at the surface. So I hope that, I know I'm going through a lot.
No, Mayuri, you're always amazing. You have brought up so many provocative and really important points that we could spend an entire yoga day exploring. And I really, really hope that we'll have an opportunity in the future to come back and talk about these things, particularly the role of the Indian in Western yoga. And then this is something that we don't explore a lot. And I think a lot of times it's very much pushed aside as another one of these uncomfortable conversations, because it's not an easy thing to have. It's extraordinarily multidimensional. So thank you very much for that answer. But it also wants me to move immediately over to Marsha and start to bring in the specific perspective of social change. And so as we start to address specifically social change, with your work in yoga therapy, what framework might you recommend to explore this intersectionality of wellness, of therapeutic perspectives and social justice from this yogic lens?
I'm glad you, yes, that's, I get it. Thank you. That's a great question here. The reality is, when we look at the framework of the intersectionality of wellness and social justice, social change, there's really 4 areas that I believe are really essential for us to be able to continue to bring about the change that's necessary for us to honor people as who they are. And so the first one is just implementing self-study. And we've been talking about that a lot already today. It's really about, who are you as an authentic person? Who are you separate from your identities, from the amount of money that you make, from the type of clothes that you wear to yoga studios or to church or wherever you're going? So this self-study to explore the intersectionality of who you are, that's the first step. And the second step for the framework, we've kind of hinted on today, and that's about building relationships. Are you taking the time, once you've done your self-study, to sit down and come across your yoga mats, to come out of your own individual communities and talk to someone who may be different from you, and really to build upon that wonderful opportunity that this universe has created for us, to build relationships, to honor the differences and the similarities of all beings? And so when we go back to step one, self-study, and then we integrate that with this concept of building relationships, we're going to need resiliency. And that's step three. We really have to foster a sense of resiliency, because this is not easy work. When you're showing up in spaces where people feel entitled to have a particular view as the only view, then you have to be really comfortable in your work that you've done and studying who you are. And also creating allies for people who will support you when you're unsure if you're going in the right path. So self-study, building relationships, making sure you are resilient. And the fourth pillar of this framework deals with compassionate action. And compassionate action doesn't mean just looking and saying, oh my, that poor soul doesn't have their foundational needs met. I will pray for them or send healing energy, or, well, you know, all the yoga terms that we use, right? I'm talking about really connecting with that person from a compassionate perspective and taking action to talk with them and say, hey, what can I do to hold space with you so that we can bring about the change that's necessary? So those are the frameworks that I'm talking about, those 4 steps: self-study, building relationships, looking at resiliency, tapping into that, and then implementing, fostering compassionate action.
You know, you went right back to the question that you were addressing before, this idea of how do we align ourselves beyond this performative gestures to really address how we bring our yoga off the mat, right?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
If I can add, the
Sure.
non-performative piece is this. When you ask people of color to take pictures and then you use those pictures for advertising purposes, and you don't honor the person that actually has lived through the experience of having that body positive body that you need in order to show the world that you are inclusive, this is what we're talking about. So I am really proud to say that I have lots of allies that value me. They value my intelligence, my lived experiences. They don't just want to take my picture or add my name to their document so they can say, I have a person of color on my team, so I am safe. It really is about honoring the human that's before you.
So let's just take this then one step further. And I'm going to ask you if you could just you brought up this very specific example of using photos of people, almost making the BIPOC in the yoga studio someone who is exploited by their very presence there. Could you continue this and become explicit as you might help answer how we could strategically embrace, once again, your word, the intersectionality of therapeutic wellness and change with and augment that with some specific examples?
Yes, most definitely. The specific examples are to really partner with our allies. And so, for example, I've partnered with a white yoga studio owner so that we can talk about the perspectives that she's dealing with in her studio. Now that there are this George Floyd issue, she started to have people on her website that are of color, and people are leaving her studio. They're like, I don't want to be a part of your yoga studio if you are embracing this concept of change. And so the specific examples that I'm talking about, that I'm suggesting, is really to go back to the philosophy that we talked about before. Go to the sutras, go to the Bhagavad Gita, understand that we have to accept each person as they are. So if we simply practice meditation, pranayama, if we tap into our own authentic selves, then we will hold space for all beings. And that means just having compassionate sharing experiences. And what I mean by that is having conversations in our virtual studios, having conversations in the park, wherever we can meet these days, and literally listening to the person that's before you and creating space so that all beings can be heard, seen, and valued. Because right now, if you're just taking my picture, if you're just adding my name to the list, you're creating more trauma for me because I've already experienced that. I've already been invited into rooms where I'm not permitted to speak. I've already been invited into situations where people don't value the intelligence and the lived experiences that I've been through. So it's important that we literally come together and listen to each other, hold space, compassionate sharing experiences. That's what I'm recommending for us today.
It sounds so very straightforward, but I think it's also very provocative, and it's a real challenge to us that maybe part of our understanding and practice will help us to embody these examples that you've given us. I'd like to take a moment and address the audience and encourage you to think of questions that you might want to direct to each of these panelists, because we do hope to get to a question and answer toward the end of the panel. So please feel free to start addressing some questions. And I'm going to, having said that, I'm going to move over to Shunya. Marsha just brought up this question of who are you when you're an authentic person? And then the title of your book, your latest book, is The Sovereign Self. And your use of the word, you use the word sovereign to describe, your use of that word is quite interesting and unique. You've introduced me to a bit about your use of the word in the conversations we've been able to have. But you have let me know that understanding the self is relevant, even more so in recent times. In the and when global experience and recognition of social injustice seems a bit more eminent. So what could you answer this question then? What role do you see yoga playing in introducing humanity to the self that is truly sovereign?
Right. So thank you for that question. And thank you, Marsha. That was beautiful. And Mayuri. If I go back to the Yoga Sutras and where Rishi Patanjali talks about the Panchakleshas, the 5 kleshas, and he begins this whole situation of us becoming as morbid as we become in our thinking from avidya. And avidya can literally be defined as a state of spiritual ignorance of who we are. And if we were to go into that self-exploration process, we might not only find out who we are, have an authentic understanding of our likes and dislikes, etc., but we might find that we share a common self with all beings, not just humans of different colors and caste and creed and race, and you may have a gender preference, religion, but literally with all beings. And this is the premise of all Indic traditions, is of this state of shared consciousness, this state of shared oneness. And from this is born dharma. We can read the books till the cows come home, but when we know ourselves, when we feel our pain, then only can we feel the pain of another. So dharma, literally, the best definition in a very simple way of dharma is adveshta sarvabhutanam, non-hatred towards all beings. So when I wanted to write sovereign and self together, I wanted to bring the invitation to all beings that come, go beyond the color of your body and the type of house you live in or the car and the people you hang out with or who you vote for. Come within, go beyond the mental clutter too. And then you shall find what is known in different traditions as Purusha or Shunyata or Atma or Brahman. It's the same thing. Apnoti iti sarvamatma, that which is boundless, and it is all pervading. And when that happens, something, and it doesn't, you don't have to be self-realized for it. The closer you come to that self, the more empathetic you become, the more understanding you become, the more compassionate you become. So sovereignty is being sovereign in that recognition of who you really are, because then you become freed from prejudice, from bigotry, from hatred. You also get freed from limitations and the hegemony of the senses, or your belief systems which are false and keep you in a limited route. So you want freedom from false beliefs, from avidya, to be truly sovereign. So the sovereignty, when we use sovereign in terms of an emperor being sovereign, they have power over others. But I ask, do you have power over your own senses? Do your senses decide how you shall perceive the world, what you shall eat next? Or do you, something sovereign within you, that Nitya Mukta, ever free self, the Atma, the light within, the source that is common to all, is going to be the leader of your destiny? There was a time in my own life when I was not sovereign. And at that time, it was my senses that called the shots, or my beliefs, or a script from my culture or society. And who knows at that time, if I had remained in that state where I was so influenceable by what I saw versus what I knew and felt, then it could have been that I could have gone on the other side of humanity, the dark side, the Asuric side. But it is because I seek to be free within. And that freedom, interestingly, connects you to Ishvara, connects you to that Isha Sarvam, Isha, that power that is dwelling within each one of us. So the journey to that sovereignty leaves you free to love, leaves you free to embrace another, leaves you free to uphold your indigenous roots and yet be embracing to the world. So I guess my work at that level is more at the nexus of avidya vidya, because if avidya remains, then only asmita will come in, where we take on a false personality of based on our color or some kind of a privilege that our race has. We all know about what happened when what has happened across the annals of time, where suddenly some people thought they are superior over others. But this stent of asmita, this false sense of ego, comes from avidya. And then it leads to likes and dislikes. I like the people who look like me, pray like me, mate like me, eat like me, sing like me, go to church like me, or go to a temple like me. And that's what creates this raga dvesha. And finally, the sense of this material identity, perishable. So we must protect ourselves from people who are coming from other countries, and somehow our planet becomes these fortresses where we have to stay. But it all began with avidya. So what I want to add to Dr. Marsha's brilliant expression is that, yes, that swadhyaya is very critical, but then the swadhyaya, can you go back to those texts like the sutras, the Gita, the Upanishads, which are leading humanity towards their true potential, a potential of true harmony, and not quick fix pacifism, but true harmony through a change of our perception. So for me, a sovereign life then is a connection to something that is boundless, loving, and truly dharmic.
Mhm.
And it's right inside me, so I got to go in.
Mhm. I wanted to go on and ask you a few more questions, but I'm going to move right over to Shyam and hopefully come back. And I note that from Nitish Kashyap, I hope I pronounced your name all right. we do have a bit more of a question for you about the sovereign self, Sangha, and lineage. But Shyam, I'm just going to move right down to you, something that you've directed me toward. As we start to think about, you bring us to this historical context, letting us, you brought up in your keynote how important our knowledge of the history is, perhaps even more so, I might be wrong, than focusing right now on the what's happening today, right? Placing it in this historical context. But in modern society, what would you say is the single obstacle to appreciating the role of diversity?
Unmute myself. So thank you. So I think one of the expectations that the Western tradition leaves us with is this idea that we have to share values and a perspective to get along. And so then being a good citizen is just about being like everybody else, but we're all different, really. So it's an impossible expectation. If we try and make it a political reality, it turns into fascism, right? Where you have this explicit domination of some view of what it is to be a participant in society. So but it shows up in all sorts of other ways, right? Like this criticism of polarization, this idea that somehow we can't all speak amicably with each other. I think what this does is it gives cover to this idea that there has to be a hegemonic us, and we can't bring up criticisms of injustice because that's to say something that you don't usually talk about, right? That's to depart from shared values and perspectives. So it's I think deeply oppressive, that expectation.
Moving on from there, can you expand a bit then on the role that yoga can play in rendering successful the prospects of diversity in life?
Right. So I think, well, especially the Yoga Sutra, right, and in the yoga tradition on the whole, teaches us that that when we focus on sovereignty, and so this is echoing Shunya's wonderful contributions. When we focus on sovereignty, we have a way of reconciling diversity, right? Because if we're really serious about sovereignty, we're serious about all of us being sovereign. And so that makes it possible for us to give each other space to be the quirky individuals that we are. And I feel like that's a gift of yoga. Yoga really teaches that. And that, of course, isn't what kind of the westernized appropriated yoga does, where it's this idea of this kind of shared beliefs and shared experiences, and don't bring up anything inconvenient about, discrimination, right? But yoga historically really teaches us, no, it's all about this echoes Mayuri's point that it's about us each working on ourselves, right? And what does that look like? Well, that looks like each one of us being concerned about our own sovereignty, or sovereignty as such.
From there, then, doesn't the shared project of devotion to sovereignty amount to some sort of shared values? And I want to point you back to your very first answer where you brought up this emergence of fascism, right? And is there some sort of relationship there?
Yeah, right. So I think the yoga is has a built-in solution to this, because part of what it is to work on our own sovereignty is to engage in swadhyaya, or self-study or self-governance, and then we have to own our own choices. That is, we discover our own bonds with our own ishtadevatas, our own chosen ideals. And so the practice of this then means that we have to give each other the room to own our own ideals. So it's not about us all agreeing about the kind of life we want to live. It's in fact this kind of radical acceptance that we might disagree about that.
And so then how then, if we allow for each of us to express ourselves in a sovereign way, right? Not treading upon the sovereignty of others, what then does that diversity in yoga really start to look like?
Well, I think that, well, when we're really doing yoga, it's a lot like normal life but better, right? So this weird idea that it's something you do on a mat in a studio with someone who's certified to do, like, that's weird, right? That's if you look historically at yoga, that wasn't yoga. Yoga was this philosophy of learning how to live your life with other people, right? And so I think when we really unpack that, it wouldn't be this exotic thing.
Mhm,
It would just be us living our best lives or working on that.
mhm. Is that something that comes about explicit, that we pursue explicitly? Or it sounds like you're saying this is implicit to the practice, the
Well,
philosophy and the theory.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a choice. I think if you don't make the right choice to practice, I mean, there's a way the Yoga Sutra begins with the choice. Either you simply treat your experiences as autobiographical, they're all teaching you about you, or you embrace your responsibility to check, control, and alter the kind of life and experience you have. And we always have this choice. So there are lots of people who say they're practicing yoga, but they're not. They just are identifying with Lululemon pants and like yoga mats and stuff like that, right? And then there's actually practicing yoga where you're always owning your choices. You're always recognizing that your experiences are a function of you. And so what is it that you're doing to change them, right? You're not being a spectator in your life. You're claiming center, the kind of being the center point of your life. So so I think there are ways that we could do this. We could just fail to do this, but then as long as we're taking the opportunity, we always have that opportunity, right? Then things go well. So this is the reality, though, of responsibility. It's up to each one of us to activate that. And when we do, and I guess this is one of the implications of the Yoga Sutra, we end up being a positive influence on others, right? So we end up showing other people that there's a way to live life where they don't treat themselves as though they're just a spectator in their own life.
Thank you for that answer.
I'm not sure. I hope it answers.
I think we went off in a bit of a different direction, but it's
Okay.
absolutely fine. One thing that I find that I often struggle with is this idea of my own idea of the world and how things should be, and how I live in a world where others profess and the same sorts of ideas I do, but live it so very differently. How I find that commonality with them, so that I don't reject others because they aren't acting the way I think you should act if you're trying to act in a way that expresses a certain belief or perspective toward life, toward self, or toward others. I was very, an example of this is I was shocked about 7 years ago to find a white supremacist group of white supremacist vegans whose vegan practice was very much a part of their white supremacy. And I had to do a lot of soul searching about what it means to adhere to a vegan lifestyle, as opposed to perhaps a white privilege, a white superiority lifestyle. But I feel like I will go off topic if I pursue that a bit. I see you thinking.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the difference between people who are embracing veganism as part of their yogic practice, the people are doing it because of white supremacy, is the white supremacists are identifying with some story about their life. And the people who are doing it as part of the yoga is that they're owning political choices as something that they have an influence on. So it seems to me that in all these kinds of cases, we can come back to this basic choice, and we have a way of understanding what the authentic engagement is like and what this kind of non-authentic engagement is like.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move us into a question and answer, but I see that it's 1:05. And so I'm going to refer back to Shunya, because I did note that Nitish Khatshap, and I think I've just destroyed the last name, gave this question in response to Shunya's sovereign self answer, how does the idea of sovereign, how does that comply with Sanya or lineage? And adds that it seems to be quite in contrast. And Shunya, if you could just address that briefly.
Yeah, sure. Sovereign is a translation of a Sanskrit word known as mukta. It also comes from moksha. Moksha is often considered as the zenith of spiritual journey. And moksha can be understood in a day-to-day life it comes from two words, moha and kshaya. Kshaya means end of moha, which means delusions, delusions of separation, delusions of supremacy, delusions of inferiority if you are feeling small, and delusions of bigness for artificial reasons, for random reasons we are feeling more superior. And they can be delusions of our attachment, delusions of thinking that we are not enough, we don't achieve something, or we don't have someone in our life. When we become free of all these delusions, kshaya, when we become free of all these mohas which pull us in different directions, we become free. Free to do what? What we already are, a beautiful being, a sublime being, a spiritual being, a boundless being with creativity and ideas within us. So sovereignty is not being used here, I think, either by Shyamji or myself, and he can speak for himself, as merely as an egotistic power position. Sovereign, somebody who is sovereign can more work with a sangha or a community because we are not fragile. We are empowered within ourselves. We are in control of our own narrative. So a sovereign being is a better team player. A sovereign being is a better citizen of this planet. Whereas when we are codependent, when we are weak, when we are overly sensitive, when we are committed to the narratives of above someone or less than someone, that is where we create messes for ourselves, emotional ones, and social injustice outside. So a sovereignty, if there is any true lineage, I'm not talking about the modern lineages cropping up, which require serfdom or to become slaves of the guru. I'm not talking about those kind of lineages because there you have no power. But if in genuine traditional lineages where knowledge is superior to the human teacher and the knowledge is liberating and freeing of your individual inner limitations, and our planetary consciousness evolves as a result, in those lineages, sovereignty is the goal of the individual. The teacher is sovereign and not dependent upon sycophancy from the students. And the teacher is sovereign. They recognize that the teacher is playing a role as a very special spiritual consultant, but they won't fall apart when they move their own journey. So this was the traditional way, sovereignty of being mukta, of free in relationships, in life, in political situations, and in the spiritual sense of being free of our identity with the body and mind was the goal of yoga. I hope that helps you.
I hope that you addressed it it was fine for me in a way that was meaningful to our questioner. Krishna, one of the participants, asked of the panel to speak about mispronunciation of Sanskrit. And I think Mayuri, you already volunteered to address that question. So could you take that on for just a moment?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, thanks for asking that question, Krishna. Yeah, I think that it reflects a very common attitude. Again, what I was speaking about before. The mispronunciation can be such a small example, but it is something that is just completely overlooked, I feel. It irks me every time when I am in a yoga class and I do hear it, because many times there's a certain sense of authority that teachers will feel or do with such command that like, this is the way. And that's very interesting for me. And I couldn't believe this. I saw YouTube videos of certain teachers, mainly white teachers, teaching people how to pronounce Sanskrit, and it was still wrong. And I'm like, where's the sense of, because it's not something, I understand if people don't have that tongue, they're trying, intention is there, but you can tell when somebody's intention is there. That's the difference. I think intention and awareness are so key. And I find that in a lot of spaces, it's just like, I'll just pronounce it however it is. The transliteration, when you can see the spelling, because English, American English doesn't have like when you translate from Sanskrit over to English in a Sanskrit class, you have the dashes on top and the signs that if you're aware of them, you would know how to pronounce them. But I do feel like there's just almost this ignorance in a way, again, that reflects a lot of yoga culture attitudes that just, it may seem so small, but to some there is this understanding that like there's a vibration and a sound and there's importance to how something is pronounced. There's a sense of understanding and respect there also, and not just throwing it around like it's no big deal. But I can tell in a class when a teacher is really attempting, but to even know that there is a way to go about pronouncing it, and a care and an attention to it. And I can tell when it's that versus just saying it however and not really caring about it. And that just goes for the attitude I feel of how that person's also teaching. And I feel like this gets thrown away so easily, so often, and it is something that can be catered to. And somebody else asked a question, I think Melissa Adelia, I believe, asked in relation to even speaking in a panel like this, the language that's being spoken. It reminds me of like in India, ancient times, whether it was Jain or Buddhist or certain the teachings that were given by the Tirthankaras or teachers or gurus at the time, they say that they spoke in Prakrit, not Sanskrit, the local language of the people. That way every being could understand, whether they were animals, supposedly, plants, living beings of any kind, so that everybody could understand, not just a learned thing that was for a learned group of people. And I find that point actually quite important and relevant even here. And I appreciate whoever had brought that up. But it goes along with all this encompasses language. And I think that in itself is something that needs to, that for a lot of South Asians, it does, like, at least for me, I know for sure, like, it's just, again, this irking thing that's like, do I even bring it up? But I do bring it up. Usually it sometimes comes out in comedy or it comes out in other ways, but it is something that, again, to me reflects the attitude of the overall culture. And so, like I said, intention and awareness, I think those are two things. And it's not just mispronouncing something just because they don't have the tongue, you know? So there's a deeper level of understanding and teaching that goes in when you go beyond just, and again, this sense of authority, like it baffles me sometimes that there is nobody that really knows it all. Or if anybody is saying that with such confidence that they do, that's when I feel something's a little off. So really taking attention to going into deeper levels. So yeah, that's what I would say to that. I hope I addressed the question.
Very nicely. I'm going to wrap us up. I'm just going to add into your response, Mayuri. In my former life, I was a professor of computer science, and as such, I was often in a position where I had many Indian students in my classes. And one thing, and sometimes yoga was something that we could bond over. They could be very excited that their professor had that practice. At other times, it was not. But one thing some of my students made me aware of, because of their unofficial position in the culture that they came from, Sanskrit was something that they were prohibited from reading, seeing, or even expressing in any way. And they made me aware of over and over again the discomfort that they had in Western yoga studios, where their teachers would banter Sanskrit around as if it were not something that might mean something to them, as if it were the teacher's belonging. And the teacher didn't really show the respect for it that they had to have in a very overt way, because they were excluded from even being able to experience Sanskrit in their life.
Yes, if I may interject, it's
Sure.
not just a language. You know, for some, this is more than just a language. In certain Western spaces, it may be a very technical thing, but that for us is oral tradition. It's communication. It is something that is very much connected. And I feel that, you know, just those things get overlooked because they can be different, interpreted in different ways at different time periods. People. And there's even been studios that have done no Sanskrit here, or there's the case in LAUSD that, you know, the families sued the LAUSD for teaching yoga to the kids and taking, you know, stripping of its Sanskrit and its meaning and its heritage, and really just, you know, dumbing it down, if you will. And I think that just if anything, that just creates more divide, rather than just learning and appreciating and really seeing into the other, or just learning more about the self. So it's a small thing on the surface, it may seem, but it roots to something so much deeper. So apologies for interjecting, but I wanted to say that.
Thank you so much for the clarification and the continuation. It is 1:16. We are at the end of our panel, but I think we've been able to touch on and go a bit deep, dive a bit deep into some really important and provocative issues. And I want to thank each and every one of our panel members for taking the time to be with us this morning. I wish to be able to pursue these conversations so much more, and your contribution has been invaluable. So thank you, and we'll end this here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.